This is the image they tried to bury. A Canadian Prime Minister standing at a podium in New Delhi, flanked by Indian flags, signing a $2.6 billion uranium deal, while the largest trading relationship in the history of the Western Hemisphere bleeds out on the floor behind him. As of this morning, Tuesday, March 4th, 2026, the Canada-United States trade relationship, a $3.5 billion per day economic artery, is functionally flatlined. The talks are frozen. The negotiating table is empty. And for the first time in the modern era, America's closest ally and largest trading partner is actively, deliberately, and publicly building an economic future that does not include the United States of America. Mark Carney, the former central banker turned prime minister, has just done something no Canadian leader has ever done. He has walked away from the table, not in a fit of rage, not as a negotiating bluff. He walked away with a dozen signed trade agreements in his briefcase and a new chief trade negotiator appointed specifically to manage what Ottawa is now calling a post-American economic strategy. The White House is scrambling. Sources inside the West Wing describe the mood as confusion bordering on panic. Trump's team spent months assuming Carney would come crawling back. He didn't. He went to Beijing. He went to Davos. He went to New Delhi. And at every stop, he signed deals that pull Canadian supply chains further from American ports. We are talking about a $7 billion agricultural export corridor to China. We are talking about a comprehensive energy partnership with India worth $2.6 billion in uranium alone. We are talking about 12 new trade agreements across 4 continents in 6 months. We are talking about the deliberate, systematic dismantling of a $700 billion annual trading relationship that has been the backbone of North American prosperity since 1989. In this report, we are going to break down exactly how this happened. We are going to look at the specific deals Carney has signed and what they mean for American workers, American farmers, and American manufacturers. We are going to explain why the CUSMA review, scheduled for July 1st, may now be dead on arrival. And we are going to answer the question that nobody in Washington wants to ask. Did Donald Trump just lose Canada? Buckle up. The maps are being redrawn in real time. To understand why Carney is in New Delhi this week instead of Washington, we have to go back to the original sin, January 20th, 2025, Trump's second inauguration. Within weeks, the president imposed 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, not targeted tariffs, not strategic tariffs, a blanket sledgehammer across every sector of the Canadian economy. For a country that sends 75% of its exports south, this was an economic declaration of war. The Canadians didn't fold. They hit back with retaliatory tariffs on American steel, aluminum, bourbon, orange juice, and consumer goods. But the real damage was psychological. Trump didn't just impose tariffs, he called Canada the 51st state. He posted altered maps showing Canadian territory absorbed into America. He threatened to seize the Gordie Howe International Bridge. He revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace. He treated America's oldest and most reliable ally like a hostile vassal state. Sources close to the Prime Minister's office say that Carney made a strategic decision sometime in the fall of 2025. The old relationship was over, not paused. Over. In October, he said it publicly. The decades-long process of ever closer economic integration between Canada and the United States is now finished. That wasn't rhetoric. That was a policy declaration. And everything that has followed, the China deal, the India trip, the Davos speech, the 12 new trade agreements, has been the execution of that policy. Here is the financial plumbing that makes this so dangerous for the American economy, and you need to understand this because the mainstream media is not explaining it. The CUSMA trade agreement, the successor to NAFTA signed during Trump's own first term, is scheduled for its mandatory 6-year review on July 1st, 2026. This is not a routine bureaucratic exercise. This is the legal framework that currently allows roughly 90% of Canadian goods to enter the United States tariff-free. It covers $3.5 billion in daily cross-border trade. It is the foundation of every integrated supply chain between Detroit and Windsor, between Montana and Alberta, between New York and Ontario. Without it, every Canadian import faces the new 10% global tariff that Trump imposed on February 24th after the Supreme Court struck down his IEEPA tariffs in a devastating 6-3 ruling. But here is the catch. And this is the part that should keep every American manufacturer awake at night. The review requires all three parties, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, to agree on whether to extend, renegotiate, or terminate the agreement. If any party walks away, the deal begins a slow death. It expires. And that $3.5 billion in daily cross-border trade gets hit with tariffs that American consumers, American businesses, and American workers will pay. Trump himself has called CUSMA irrelevant. He has called it a deal with no real advantage to the United States. He visited a Ford plant in Michigan and said the agreement had served its purpose. He is undermining his own leverage while Canada builds lifeboats. Sources inside Canada's trade ministry say Ottawa is now operating on two tracks simultaneously. Track one is the formal CUSMA review, which they will participate in because walking away would be economic suicide. Track two is the diversification strategy, building enough non-American trade volume that when CUSMA does collapse, and they believe it will, the blow is survivable. Janice Charette, the former clerk of the Privy Council, was appointed chief trade negotiator on February 16th, specifically to manage this dual-track approach. She answers directly to Carney and Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc. This isn't a bureaucratic shuffle. This is a war cabinet appointment. Let us talk about the specific deals Carney has signed and why each one is a knife in the back of American trade dominance. Target 1, China. In January, Carney traveled to Beijing and signed a narrow trade arrangement that cuts tariffs on several sectors of Canadian exports. The centerpiece is agricultural access worth $7 billion in new markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fish harvesters. Trump immediately threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if the deal went through. Carney's response was to stand at a podium and say he meant what he said. The deal stands. Target 2, India. This week, Carney is in New Delhi signing a $2.6 billion uranium supply deal and launching formal negotiations on a comprehensive economic partnership. India, a nation of 1.4 billion consumers with a GDP growing at 7% annually, is being positioned as the long-term replacement market for Canadian energy, critical minerals, and agricultural exports that currently flow south. Target 3, the European Union. Canada has become a partner in the EU's Safe Defence Spending Programme, a €150 billion financial instrument. This isn't just trade. This is military-industrial integration with Europe that explicitly reduces Canadian dependence on American defense contracts. Target 4, Mercosur. Carney has accelerated negotiations with the South American trade bloc that includes Brazil and Argentina. Target 5, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN. The Prime Minister has been circling the globe, literally, signing defense procurement pacts and trade agreements on every continent. The cumulative effect is staggering. According to Global Affairs Canada, non-U.S. exports grew by 17.2% in 2025, nearly offsetting the 5.8% decline in exports to the United States. The U.S. share of Canadian goods exports fell to 71.7%. The lowest since the early 1980s, before Canada even had a free trade agreement with America. Now here is where this becomes a constitutional crisis for the Trump administration. The president built his entire economic platform on the premise that tariffs give America leverage, that other countries need American consumers more than America needs their goods, that the threat of exclusion from the world's largest market would bring every nation to its knees. Canada was supposed to be the proof of concept. The first domino, the easy win. Instead, Canada became the proof of failure. Carney didn't fold, he pivoted, he built a coalition. At Davos in January 2026, he stood on the world stage and delivered a speech that sources inside the State Department describe as the most damaging foreign policy address against American interests in a generation. He said middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He called on nations to publicly condemn economic coercion, even when practiced by an ally. He was talking about the United States. Every diplomat in the room knew it. Trump knew it. The president responded by revoking Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, threatening 100% tariffs, threatening to block the Gordie Howe Bridge, and threatening tariffs on Canadian aircraft. But here is what nobody in the mainstream media is telling you. The threats aren't working. They are accelerating the diversification. Every time Trump escalates, Carney signs another deal. It is a feedback loop of economic decoupling that is now running on its own momentum. The psychological dimension of this collapse is something the West Wing fundamentally does not understand. Sources close to the Trump trade team say the president still believes Carney will come back to the table on American terms. He reportedly told advisors after their phone call in January that Carney was impressed by Trump's negotiating position. Meanwhile, Carney was simultaneously telling the Canadian Parliament that almost nothing is normal in the United States. That is not the language of a man preparing to capitulate. That is the language of a man who has already left. The cognitive dissonance inside the White House is dangerous. Trump's trade representative, Jamieson Greer, went on television last week and said Canada needs to accept that tariffs will be part of any deal. He said the CUSMA review would follow a traditional process, but there is nothing traditional about this process. The trade talks are suspended. They have been suspended since October 2025, when Trump terminated negotiations after an Ontario provincial government advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs sent the president into a fury. That was 4 months ago. The table has been empty for 4 months. And in those 4 months, Carney has signed more international trade agreements than any Canadian prime minister in history. Let us push this to the worst case scenario, and I want you to understand this is not speculation. This is based on the trajectory that leaked planning documents from Ottawa describe. It is July 1st, 2026. The CUSMA review deadline arrives. Canada, having spent 6 months building alternative trade infrastructure, enters negotiations with a fundamentally different posture than anyone in Washington expected. They are no longer negotiating from desperation. They are negotiating from diversification. Their non-U.S. exports have grown by double digits. Their trade relationships span 4 continents. Their defense procurement is increasingly European and Asian. They have leverage they have never had before. Greer demands that Canada accept permanent tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles as a condition of renewal. Carney looks at the numbers. Canadian auto production has already dropped 5.4%. The jobs are already gone. The pain has already been absorbed. He says no. Trump, enraged, announces the United States is withdrawing from CUSMA entirely. The agreement enters its 6-year wind-down period. But the damage is immediate and catastrophic. Markets react within minutes. The $700 billion annual trade relationship is suddenly operating without a legal framework. Every supply chain that crosses the border, automotive parts, energy, lumber, minerals, food, faces immediate uncertainty. The integrated North American manufacturing base, built over 3 decades, begins to fracture. Auto plants in Michigan that depend on Canadian parts face 25% cost increases overnight. Energy imports from Alberta face new tariffs. The price of Canadian lumber, already subject to punishing duties, becomes prohibitive, sending American housing costs into the stratosphere. But it gets worse. The second worst-case scenario involves what military strategists call bandwagoning. Canada's diversification strategy succeeds not because Canadian markets can replace American volume. Nobody believes that in the short term. It succeeds because it demonstrates to every other American ally that there is an alternative. If Canada can survive decoupling from the United States, so can the European Union, so can Japan, so can South Korea, so can Australia. The Carney Doctrine, as foreign policy analysts at Chatham House are calling it, becomes a template. Middle powers unite. They build redundant supply chains. They create alternative financial instruments. They stop treating American market access as essential and start treating it as optional. This is the scenario that should terrify the Treasury Department. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, went on CNBC and warned Carney not to pick a fight going into the CUSMA review. He said he's seen what happens when a technocrat tries to pivot and become a politician. It never works out well. But Bessent is wrong. Carney isn't pivoting from technocrat to politician. He is using his technocratic expertise, 2 decades running the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, to engineer the most sophisticated economic realignment in Canadian history. He understands bond markets. He understands currency flows. He understands exactly how to restructure a national economy away from a single dominant trading partner. This is his area of expertise. Trump brought a sledgehammer to a chess match. Here is the domino that falls next, and nobody in Washington is talking about it. The U.S. Supreme Court's February 20th decision striking down Trump's IEEPA tariffs didn't just invalidate a trade policy. It invalidated the legal foundation of the president's entire leverage strategy. The 6-3 ruling found that using emergency powers to impose tariffs was unconstitutional. Trump immediately pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act, imposing a new 10% global tariff. But Section 122 has a 150-day time limit unless Congress extends it. Congress, facing midterm elections in November 2026, is unlikely to extend tariffs that are raising consumer prices across the board. So the president is now operating on a legal ticking clock. His tariff authority is eroding. His leverage is diminishing. And the countries he was supposed to be intimidating are signing deals with each other instead of with him. The irony is devastating. Trump's tariffs were supposed to bring manufacturing back to America. Instead, they are pushing Canada's manufacturing partnerships to India, Europe, and the Pacific. Auto production in Canada dropped 5.4% in 2025, but that production didn't come to America. It went offshore. The tariffs didn't reshore jobs. They redirected supply chains to countries that are now building economic alliances specifically designed to exclude American influence. What does Beijing think when it watches this? What does the Chinese Communist Party see when Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of America's closest ally, flies to Beijing and signs a trade deal over the explicit objections of the American president? They see weakness. They see an empire that cannot hold its own allies. They see the most important bilateral trade relationship in the Western Hemisphere disintegrating because one man couldn't resist the urge to humiliate his neighbor. In authoritarian capitals, this is interpreted as proof that democratic alliances are fragile, that they can be shattered by a single election, that the American century is ending not with a military defeat, but with a trade war that turned friends into competitors. Putin sees it, Modi sees it, the Gulf states see it, and they are all recalibrating their own relationships with Washington accordingly. The projection of economic power relies on the projection of reliability. The image of the Canadian Prime Minister signing deals in Beijing and New Delhi while trade talks with Washington sit frozen is a billboard advertising American unreliability to the world. Remember the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Congress passed sweeping tariffs to protect American industry during the early Depression. The result was catastrophic. Trading partners retaliated. Global trade collapsed by 65%. The Depression deepened. Economists from Milton Friedman to Ben Bernanke have identified Smoot-Hawley as one of the great policy disasters of the 20th century. We are watching a 21st century version play out in real time. The mechanics are different, the legal instruments are different, but the fundamental error is identical. The belief that the world's largest economy can use tariffs as a weapon without consequences. The belief that trading partners will absorb punishment indefinitely rather than find alternatives. The belief that economic coercion strengthens alliances rather than destroying them. The founders understood this. Alexander Hamilton argued for strategic tariffs, not punitive ones. He understood that trade relationships are built on mutual benefit, not domination. The emoluments clause exists because the founders feared a president whose personal financial interests would corrupt trade policy. The constitutional framework was designed to prevent exactly this kind of self-destructive economic nationalism. This is the stress test of the North American economic order. Can the world's most important bilateral trading relationship survive a president who treats his closest ally like an enemy? Can the integrated manufacturing base, built over 3 decades of careful negotiation from Mulroney to Clinton to Trump's own first term, withstand the demolition crew that has been swinging sledgehammers at it for 14 months? Can the American economy absorb the loss of its largest trading partner, a partner that supplies 60% of American crude oil imports, 85% of its electricity imports, and the critical minerals that power every semiconductor and every American weapon system, while simultaneously fighting trade wars with China, the European Union, and half the developing world? The answer, according to sources inside the Pentagon who are watching this with growing alarm, is no. Not without significant economic pain. Not without American jobs lost. Not without American prices rising. Not without American strategic interests being compromised in ways that will take decades to repair. We are in uncharted waters. The CUSMA review is 4 months away. The Supreme Court has gutted the president's tariff authority. Canada is signing deals on 4 continents. The trade talks remain suspended. And the man who was supposed to be America's easiest negotiating partner is currently on the other side of the planet, building an economic future that doesn't need Washington's permission. So as we head into March, watch the CUSMA negotiations. Watch whether formal talks actually begin or whether the suspension continues into a fifth month. Watch the Section 122 tariff clock, which gives Trump only 150 days of authority unless Congress acts, and that clock started ticking on February 24th. Watch the Canadian non-U.S. export numbers, which are the real scoreboard of this trade war. Watch India and the critical minerals deals. Watch the defense procurement agreements with Europe. Watch whether other middle powers follow the Carney template. But most importantly, watch the tone. When Carney stands in the Canadian Parliament and says the world has changed and Washington has changed and almost nothing is normal in the United States, he is not making a political statement. He is not posturing for domestic consumption. He is delivering a eulogy. The old relationship is dead. The new one hasn't been born yet. And in the void between what was and what will be, $400 billion in potential trade deals are dying on the table while the president tweets about making Canada the 51st state. The sheriff isn't at the door this time. The neighbor has simply packed his bags and left. And the house is getting very, very cold. Subscribe, stay tuned. The maps are being redrawn and nobody in Washington is paying attention.